So we are all set to write our component test for the app component. So let's begin by importing everything that we will need. So first up at the very top, I'll begin by importing the render function and the screen object, and that's going to come from @testing-library/React. As a reminder, render is the function we're going to use to render or instantiate our component, in this case app, on the virtual DOM. And then screen is the object that we're going to use for query methods that will allow us to search for certain elements on the DOM, for example, by their role, right? Or by label text as another example. The next thing I want to import is user event. And that is a helpful object that is going to allow us to simulate user actions, such as clicks, or in the case of this component, such as typing a character into an input field. And this is going to come from @testing-library/user-event. Then we have Axios imported and mocked out, which is great. And then the final thing we need, and I'm just going to place all my imports together. I'm also going to do a line break between my NPM imports versus my local project imports. The last thing we need, of course, is the component itself, which is in the same directory as my app.test.js file. So right here, I will import the app component from /app. So within the current directory, find the app.js file. All right. So we have this setup right here. Obviously, our description here is no longer relevant. It no longer doesn't matter. It now does matter. So I'm just going to describe what we're actually testing here. And I'm going to say the app component shows employees that match user's search term. That describes the user value and doesn't care about the implementation. We'll test the actual implementation in our actual test and the assertions. All right, so normally this would be where we go ahead and render our component, but the first thing I want to do is to make sure that Axios get is going to resolve to give us a valid value. So once again, when we use the mock resolved value method, we specify that when Axios get is called, it's going to give us a promise that resolves asynchronously to give us this final result, right? And that is going to match the API or the interface of the Axios library. So in the real world, remember we have our component did mount lifecycle hook that will run automatically when the component renders. So when we use render within our test with React testing library, this logic will still run, right? And thus we're going to need to make sure that what we return here is something valid. So this right here is totally valid as well, because we could simply have an object with a data property that has an empty array of employees, but I don't think it communicates the way the real world will operate. Obviously, in the real world, the page will load, the component will instantiate, and it's going to typically have all of the available employees, right? That's how we start out, and then we type characters and see that collection of cards decrease. So just to come up with the simplest example that I can, the way I want this test to read is I'm going to first tell Axios.get to return me an array of 2 employees. Then I'll have the test type a sample character into the input and then test that that collection of 2 is filtered down to just 1, right? There's no reason to create 10 employees and filter down to 8 because that additional data creation and all that additional typing doesn't add any value. The simplest test will suffice. So narrowing down from an original starting point of 2 employees down to 1 validates that the component is doing everything it's supposed to, right? So right here, let's provide an array of 2 employee objects. And as a reminder, every employee is going to have 4 properties: ID, name, initials, and description. Once again, these values don't really matter. It's up to us, but we want to make it resemble the real world as much as possible. So right here, I'm going to give my first employee an ID of 1, a name of Buzz Lightyear, and then we need initials, so that's going to be BL, and then finally the description, and that's going to be Space Traveler. Let's save that. There we go. And then at the end, I'm going to add another object, very similar. It's going to have an ID of 2. It's going to have a name of Mr. Potato Head. It's going to have initials of PH. And it's going to have a description property set to international movie icon. All right. So once again, by using the jest.mock method, we have replaced all of Axios' methods with jest mock functions. And now we specifically focused on get and told it that it should represent an asynchronous operation, an asynchronous method that will return a promise that resolves to be an object with a data property set to an array of 2 employees. So now all this code right here, when the component did mount lifecycle method runs, will be valid, right? Because right here, axios.get will instead get this promise that will resolve with the await keyword to give it an object with a data property. Here, we're going to reach into that data property to pull out employees, which is going to be our array of 2 employee objects. And then we're going to set the component's initial state and provide that array of 2 employee objects to be the employee's state property. So everything should function just fine. So I'm going to, right here, use our render. Just want to make sure I'm in the right location. It looks like I am in the right place. Yep. So we're going to invoke the render function from React Testing Library, and then we're going to provide our app component. And remember, we need to actually provide the actual closing, self-closing tag, right? We don't just want to pass an app by itself. We want to instantiate it the same way we do in our regular React code base. Now you'll notice we have a little bit of a warning here. We do have a passing test suite, so nothing is specifically breaking, but we do have a warning or an error from React Testing Library. And the reason this is happening is, remember that this logic is running after the component is mounted on the DOM. So what's happening is our test is rendering the component, which means it's putting it on the DOM, and then this logic is running and updating the employee slice of state. And the reason React Testing Library doesn't like that is because it sees an update that happens after we have put this thing on the DOM. And that's totally normal. It's just React Testing Library warning us that, hey, you might have some kind of data that is changing that we want you to be aware of because this thing is changing after we put it on the DOM. And that's exactly how component did mount is supposed to work, so that's totally fine. And the way we're going to solve this problem is actually just by continuing to write our test. And as we'll see, we're going to have access to additional methods in React Testing Library that will wait until the component is done with all of its updates and all of its state changes and all of its re-renders. And that will allow this problem to go away naturally. So you're going to see this error disappear as we write more code. All right. But let's think about what needs to happen next. Let's ignore this error for just a second and imagine that the user has successfully rendered the app component in the browser. What's the next step? The next step is the user is going to type a character into the text box, which we are now getting from our actual Material UI component library, right? It is going to be this text field component right here. But this under the hood is going to be a regular input component, an input element to be more specific, with a type of text, which means we're going to be able to use the familiar getByRole method from React Testing Library to look for an element with the role of text box and a name of employee name, which is the label that the user sees right here. But before we want the user to type in the character, remember that our Axios get method call, which is going to run on every single character press, and that logic is wired up right here, right? This logic is going to run on every character press, and if we leave the code as it is right now, this is what we're going to return every single time, that continual array of 2 employees, right? Just as a very quick reminder of what we wrote here, right here, when the user types a character, we update the component state, more specifically the search term piece of state, which triggers the component did update lifecycle method to run, which double checks whether the current state does not equal the previous state. In this case, it won't because the user has 1 character entered for search term and the previous version of search term had an empty string. So we're going to run this logic, and this once again is going to use axios.get to make a request to this endpoint, and we've already wired up that response. So what I'm going to do is redefine the mock resolved value of Axios get so it returns us an array of just 1 employee. Basically, what I'm doing is simulating how our backend will behave in the real world. Once again, we don't have a real backend here. We are simply taking the place of Axios.get and simulating or emulating or acting out how a backend would respond. So now the simplest way to represent this logic in our test is the user is going to get 2 employees, and then they're going to type a character, and then the backend, or in this case, the mock function that is replacing Axios.get, will return 1 employee instead of 2. And then I can verify that the user sees everything correctly on the screen. So right here, after we render the component, I'm going to once again say Axios.get, and then mock resolve value. Once again, I provide what I want the promise to resolve to right here. It's going to be an object with a data property. That is because that is what the real world Axios.get implementation works, or how it works. And that is going to be an array. But this time around, we're going to assume that we only get the 2nd employee right here, Mr. Potato Head. So right here, save that. And so moving forward, whenever we use any functionality of our component that relies on axios.get, this logic will take over compared to this logic, which was the initial one, the initial resolved value for that method. All right. So now that we know our fake backend right here, so to speak, is set up to return a valid response, let's now simulate the user actually typing into our input. So here is that text field right here, and I'm going to search for it. So right here, I'm going to say const employee name input, and we do have that imported screen object. And as a reminder, that has a method on it called getByRole, and that is the first approach, the recommended approach to query in React Testing Library. And we want to look for an element in our component with a role of text box. And as a reminder, we can provide a configuration object as the second argument. Here, I'll provide a name property set to a regex of employee name, and then I will add that little I at the end, which will make the search case insensitive. So our label has employee name with a capital E and a capital N. Right here, we're making it case insensitive. So no matter what that label is, maybe tomorrow another developer will lowercase this N. It doesn't matter because we're still going to be able to find this valid employee name input. So the test is not failing, it's passing. We are getting that former warning, but that's totally fine. So of course, the next thing to do is to simulate the user typing into this input. So as a reminder, we have our user event object that has a type method. The first argument it expects is what we're typing into. In this case, it's going to be our employee name input. We've actually located that DOM node on our virtual DOM with this getByRole method. And then the second argument is what we want to simulate typing into the input. Let's say the user types in P. And again, this is kind of arbitrary because it doesn't really matter what we do, but I do want the test to actually tell a story. So for example, if we're starting with these two employees and I type P, then it makes sense that Mr. Potato Head would be the one that's returned because that matches it, right? Because we are mocking out our response, it doesn't really matter, but I want a reader who's going through this test to have a valid, consistent story. So it makes sense to type in a character that would return a response like this from the backend. All right, so we're typing in a sample character of P. All right, so the next step is to await and make sure that once the a request is made, which again is going to happen right here, we're going to hit axios.get, which means we're going to hit this logic in our test, and then the component is going to get that new state of employees. Now it's going to be an array of one employee, and then it's going to re-render, and then when it re-renders, I want to verify that that is the card that the user sees. So this is where we're actually going to be able to get rid of the error that we see right here. So I'm going to write out the code, and then we're going to talk about what it's doing. So right here, I'm going to say const card, and I'm going to use the await keyword. So I'm going to call a method on the screen object that actually returns a promise, and that method is called findByText. And the text I'm going to look for anywhere within my DOM is going to be the text Mr. Potato Head, which of course is the name right here. Now, a couple of things. The first thing is because we're using await right here, I have to make sure to make my test function async. So I'm just going to add this async functionality right here. So if there's any code in your test that involves a method that returns a promise, you're going to need to make the test async in order to use the await keyword. Now, down here, we're using the await keyword, and this is our first experience with using any kind of method from the React testing library that starts with the text findBy. Previously, we used methods that began with the name getBy, and here's the difference. GetBy is synchronous, which means it's going to look for that entry or that element, or in this case, an element with a role, instantaneously. Right then and there in our current DOM, it's going to look for it. So if it doesn't find it at that moment, at that exact moment in time, then it's going to, of course, throw an error. So it is synchronous and happens right then and there. In comparison, findByText is asynchronous. So what it's actually going to do is return a promise, and that promise is going to wait for 1 second. So it's going to wait for a second and then check whether what we're searching for is actually found in the DOM. And that second is going to be critical because it's going to allow the component to re-render and thus allow us to perform the search after the re-render. So remember, when the user types this character, we are making this fake request to our backend right here, and then we're getting this array of one employee and we're setting state. And that process will take a couple of milliseconds, right? And so we need to give the component time to receive this employee's bunch of state, to call set state, to re-render and to see those new cards being rendered onto the screen. And so what find by text will do is it'll give us a little bit of time for that operation to complete. And then after that, we can query for the card because it should exist at that point. The problem with using get by text is that search will begin instantaneously in the moment. And if that occurs right then and there, we might not have enough time from a JavaScript runtime perspective for all this logic to execute to set the employee state and to update the DOM, which is ultimately what we're querying using React Testing Library. So the reason that these find by methods exist in React Testing Library is to return a promise that gives us a little bit of time to wait for the component to update. And that's exactly what we need to do here because the component needs to wait to receive this response and then re-render. Once again, we're not actually receiving a response. We are simulating it by telling Axios get to give us a new array of one employee, but we're emulating the exact same functionality we have in the real world. We want to wait a second while our hypothetical API responds. You'll notice because that is going to give the component time to re-render, our former error in the console is going to go away, and that is because our test now ends after all of those updates and re-renders, which means React Testing Library has no surprises. It no longer needs to warn us that, hey, the test ended and then something changed like your state. Now we have waited completely until all of the re-renders, and so React Testing Library is not surprised by any further state updates or any further re-renders. So the problem went away naturally. All right, so I have now looked for a element on my DOM with the text Mr. Potato Head, and all I want to check here using expect is that that's going to exist somewhere in the document. So the simplest test that I can write is simply, hey, whatever I get back here is an employee that is filtered Mr. Potato Head, and so I expect a card, or to be frank, anything in the DOM with that text. Because if that is there, then I know that I have correctly filtered. Again, I'm simulating that response, right? We're not actually filtering, that logic is on the back end, but we're testing this component the way that a user would interact with it. They're going to type a character, then they're going to confirm that they see a card on the screen that matches what they have filtered by, okay? There's one more assertion that I want to write in this test, and that is verifying that we issue the correct Axios get method call. So what that means is when the user types a character, I want to validate, number one, that I'm hitting the right endpoint, and number two, that I am providing the correct configuration object, which should have a Q property right here that is going to be equal to what the user entered, which for us is the letter P. And now, because we have a mock function, as we learned in the previous lesson, we can test whether it has been invoked and with what arguments. So here's how I can write that assertion. Right here, I'm going to say expect Axios.get. Remember, that is a just mock function, so we could pass it in just like so. And then, as a reminder, that assertion is called to have been called with, which will verify not only that Axios get was invoked or executed at some point since its creation, which was created when we ran just.mock, by the way, but also verify that we have passed Axios.get the correct arguments, which we specify right here. So if everything worked correctly, this code ran right here, which means we should have passed get our URL, which is going to be http://localhost:4000/employees. And then the second argument to this get method call in our component did update lifecycle method should have been an object, and that object should have had a params property set to another object, and that inner object should have had a Q property set to this.state.search term, which is what the user just entered, which for us we know is going to be the character P right here. So I'm going to provide P right here. And this is testing, once again, that we are giving the right data to Axios.get to work with. We're not using the real implementation of Axios.get, which is why it's important to verify that we are giving our mock the data that it needs, or the data that the real Axios does expect in order to do its job. We are testing the interaction between our app component and the Axios get method without being concerned about how the Axios get method works with those inputs, because we don't care, because that's other people's code. But our interaction with their code, our interaction with their library method does matter. And this is what we're verifying here, that we are providing the right inputs. A string representing the URL we want to hit, and a configuration object that will specify the query that we want to make in order for our backend to filter. All right, so now you can see everything is passing and we are interacting with our app component the way that a user will. Rendering it, typing a character, verifying that our card is on screen, and verifying from a technical perspective that we have invoked the correct method on Axios and passed it the correct inputs, the correct arguments. All right, that's all there is to cover in this lesson, so I will see you in the next one.